So at the conclusion of this training, learners will be able to do 4 things. The first of which is you will be able to explain how WCAG 2.2 builds on earlier WCAG 2X versions. The second of which is you will be able to identify what end users most benefit from the new criteria. A quick caveat is that these are the end users that most benefit, not the only end users who benefit, because as with most things accessibility, a lot of these improvements, a lot of these criteria benefit a lot more people than just the intended target group. The third thing you'll be able to do is recognize the 9 new WCAG 2.2 success criteria across 4 separate guidelines and the 1 remove criteria. And the fourth and final learning objective for today is that you will be able to determine next steps for incorporating WCAG 2.2 into design and development processes. So with that being said, I am going to go ahead and kick it over to John so he can talk through what does WCAG 2.2 do.
Great, thank you, Nell. So WCAG 2.2 builds on the previous versions of the WCAG standards. What that means is it extends that by adding new success criteria. And there is one criteria that is actually removed in 2.2, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But it does keep the backwards compatibility of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. It ensures that if you conform to WCAG 2.2, you will still conform to 2.1 and 2.0. That's the backwards compatibility. It also maintains the same conformance model. So conformance is typically measured on a page-by-page basis. The whole page has to conform at the whole level. Those types of things remain in this version. So it's not reshuffling it. And then new criteria, which there are 9 of, 9 new criteria, those are best addressed in the design phase. So when thinking about these, think about how could we start to incorporate these new criteria into the things we are designing from the start. And that's the best way to implement 2.2. But we will provide some of those, some direction at the end of the presentation today on how you can apply what you've learned. Just a note before we get into numbers, and I know sometimes the numbering and in the standard can be confusing, but we did want to call out, for example, with guideline 3.3 input assistance as an example here, how the numbering works. So WCAG 2.2 came out in 2008, 2.1 in 2018, and then 2.2 came out in October of 2023. And so what the group wanted to make sure is that we didn't cause confusion by renumbering things. And so the new criteria are added on to the guidelines where they are most relevant. And so that means that you may have an existing criteria. For example, we have 3.5 help. You may have that followed by 3.36, and then 2.2 criteria come in, they just add on to those numbers. So we have 3.7, which is redundant entry. And again, don't worry so much about the numbers. You don't have to memorize those numbers. But the idea is it's level A, but it appears in the order after AAA. So just be mindful of that. The only reason this was done was to keep the ordering consistent from previous versions, so the numbers don't chain across versions. But you may have A and AA criteria that appear at the end of a guideline. So what is the user impact? What was the intention of creating these new criteria? And let me say, WCAG 2.2 was a challenge. It took 5 years to be created, and because of that, it's very difficult to add new criteria in the current WCAG model. because you have to meet all the criteria on a whole page in order to conform. And so, unfortunately, not all of the user needs could be put into WCAG 2.2 criteria. But there were three main groups where the team was looking to make progress. And so that's users with low vision, users with motor disabilities, in particular users with hand or arm related disabilities, and then people who are neurodiverse, who have cognitive and learning disabilities. And so these aren't the only groups who benefit. Everybody benefits, other disabilities benefit as well for some of these, but these are the three areas. And the new criteria primarily map to these, but this is not, WCAG as a whole, for example, it is not, does not mean that everybody can use it. And so there's continued work that needs to be done to make things more accessible to a much wider group of people. And in particular, the area of cognitive and learning disabilities is an area where there is much more effort needed. Let's talk about, let's pause for a second to find out if there's any questions related to what we have covered so far.
This is Nell. I don't see any questions, but John, I actually have a question. Could you provide a bit of context of the work you have done on WCAG so that our learners can know a bit about your involvement in it?
Sure, and of course, I'm not speaking on behalf of W3C, but on behalf of Level and the work that we've done. So Level Access is a member of the W3C. W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium that is the standards body that creates the web content accessibility guidelines and has done that since the first version was created in 1999. So we've been involved in looking at user needs and converting those user needs and requirements into testable outcomes that can be tested. And what's unique about WCAG is it is a standard, but it is voluntary, but it's been adopted into regulations like Section 508, like the European standards. It is adopted into requirements, and so because of that, it has to be testable, has to be repeatable, and so it's very tricky. So it's a lot of work to try to write standards that really can be used and adopted into regulations. So that's been one of the challenges and why it's taken so long. And I will also talk a little bit in a minute about WCAG 3.0, which is the future, and how that could be slightly different than, it will definitely be different than what we have today with the 2X series of guidelines.
Great. Thanks so much, John. This is Nell. I am going to really quickly put in the chat the WCAG 2.2 W3C link. And with that, we can go ahead. There are no other questions.
Great. So what's new with the 2.2 criteria? So there's two principles. Remember, there's 4 principles in WCAG. But there's the new criteria fall under 2 of those principles, which are the operable and the understandable. And there really is, can the user operate and navigate? First principle, and understandable is, can you understand the interface? Can you understand the information? So the first guideline is related to navigability, and it's basically, can you find and navigate in a way that's possible by users who use different types of technology? So is it, can you navigate? That's the first guideline that the criteria fall under. The second one is input modalities, and people use technology in different ways. For example, some people use the keyboard, some people use a pointer or a touch interface. Some people use a switch control, which is an input modality which may be programmatically clicking a button on a screen and not physically clicking it. So there's different ways people input and interact with content. And then the next guideline is under the principle of understandable, that is predictable. Predictability is really important, and making sure that people can know what to expect when they come to a website and that it works consistently across that site. And then the last guideline is related to input assistance. And so we want to help people to not create errors. And then if they do create errors, how can we help people fix those errors? So those are the four guidelines that the new criteria fall under. So let's talk about the 9 new criteria. There are 6 at A and AA, and then there are 3 at AAA. So total wise, if you like totals, that would mean there would be 56 total WCAG criteria. But in a minute, we'll talk about one of the criteria that was removed from WCAG 2.2. So that'll put us back at 55 A and AA criteria. Okay, so what are the different criteria here? So the first one deals with focus being obscured, and there's two criteria related to this. One is a minimum version, and one is an enhanced version. And typically, when you find this, the enhanced version is at a level AAA, and then the minimum version is either an A or AA. So in this case, it's a AA. And then there's focus appearance, which is also AAA. Now, this AAA requirement, we're not going to go into a lot of detail, as much detail on the AAA requirements here, but we will cover them to some degree. This one was very particularly hard to test and very difficult. And so you may be asking, well, how did some of these end up in AAA versus AA? It came down to whether these can be done in all situations and how difficult they were to be testable. And the group felt like this was one that belonged in that category because of the difficulty in applying it in all situations and testing for it. Under input modalities, the 2 criteria relating to dragging movements. And so when you think about dragging, it doesn't just have to be a pointer. It could be a touch interface, some sort of pointer, not just a mouse interface. And then target size. And that's the area where you may be using a pointer to activate a target. What is that size? And there are other criteria that existed. We have a previous one from WCAG 2.1 related to target size as well. And we'll show you how that relates to this one. And next, we have 3 consistent help. And so you may recall that WCAG has consistent navigation, consistent identification. This is essentially an additional item related to consistent help, making sure that people can find things in predictable ways. And then finally, we have 3 criteria related to redundant entry. So if you're entering something in a form, you don't have to keep entering that same information over and over again. And then 2 related to accessible authentication. So making sure that you don't have to root transcribe or remember things for authentication process. And with that, we have a AA and then an enhanced version at AAA. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that one criterion was removed from WCAG 2.2, and that's related to parsing. That's 411 for this collect the numbers. And so why was this removed, and what's the impact we have? So what does it cover? So previously, this criterion covered things like duplicate IDs, start and end tags that may have not been present, or improper nesting of HTML elements. If you've ever used an HTML validator, this is the type of thing that would be covered by an HTML validator. Typically, these things are fixed by the browsers today. The way assistive technology works is the assistive technology is most likely either using the accessibility object model in the browser, or it's using the DOM, but the browser has already fixed a lot of these issues. So this seemed like it was just causing a lot of extra work because it was failing things that weren't impacting the user, that weren't a problem in today, and it was creating a lot of white noise for people to fix issues that weren't really having any impact. And what the group found is that it was really no longer needed, in that if there were issues related to this particular criterion, they would probably be caught by other criteria as well. So if you have duplicate IDs and those duplicate IDs affect the name of a control, say a checkbox, if the wrong name is used for that checkbox, it's going to fail one of the other criteria already related to name role state or name role value, or it's going to fail information relationships. It's going to fail another criteria. So the group looked at it and said, those things are already going to be caught. So what does this mean? It means it's been officially removed from WCAG 2.2. It also means that WCAG 2.1 was republished with a note saying that 411 would be considered met, and that there was an errata published for WCAG 2.0, but it wasn't the whole standard wasn't republished, saying that it would be met. And so the accessibility conformance report, the VPAT format, has also been updated to communicate that 411 is considered already met, and if there are any issues impacting the user, they would be caught under other criteria. So that's the update, and that means that WCAG 2.2 is still backwards compatible with 2.1 and 2.0 because of these modifications that I've discussed. So I think that brings us to questions for this section.
Yes, this is now, John, we do have one question asking, how does guideline 3.2 predictable impact mobile native?
Mobile native applications. So just real quick, I think the 3.2 is about that predictability and consistent help, consistent navigation, consistent identification. So while some users may not be navigating as much with the keyboard, screen reader users still will navigate past groups of information. Consistent help, which we'll cover, is aimed at people with cognitive and learning disabilities, people who are neurodiverse. And so that consistency is not just in the sense of navigating with the keyboard, but is also applicable to people who are looking visually within a navigation structure for information to appear in a certain way. So if you want help information, you always know you can find help in this location, that type of thing. And so it applies visually, not just with certain interactions like keyboard. But if you have more specific questions when we get there, we can cover those.
Great, thanks. We have one more question as well as a comment. The comment is somebody agreeing that yes, it was quite difficult testing parsing. So there's some agreement there. And then the question that came in is, do you know what criteria handles duplicate IDs for non-form items? I have heard that this is problematic for some.
So I think what you're getting at is maybe so ARIA could refer to something with a duplicate ID, may not be form related. Maybe it's for opening up a menu or a navigation structure. So if we're not testing for duplicate IDs, what would be the what would it be covered under? So there is some mappings. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but I'll just say if you had a duplicate ID problem, it could impact 131 information relationships because the information relationship may not be communicated. So that is one place, or 412 name role state. The other place where you could have some things is sometimes you have incorrect nesting, like you have a link nested within a button, and you can't have a link within a button because it causes all sorts of issues. It could cause keyboard issues, for example. So some of them could fall under some of those other requirements related to the keyboard, as an example, 211.
That's great. Thanks so much. That's it for our questions. So I will go ahead and hop back on for this next section. And so let us talk a little bit first about the 3 new navigable success criteria, which again, this sits in that operable principle. So we're talking about operability. And when we're thinking about who most benefits from the new WCAG 2.2 navigable success criteria, we are thinking about who is going to benefit most from AA 2.4.11 focus not obscured minimum, and then it's 3A version at 2.4.12 focus not obscured enhanced, and that 2.4.13 focus appearance. So at the beginning of each of our guidelines, as we talk through today's session, we're going to introduce you to the end users who benefit most, so we can all better understand the impact of why we are implementing these new criteria, of why these new criteria have been put into place. In our resource document we will be providing afterwards, there will be links to take you to the understanding of each of these criteria as well for more detail. But the first group that most benefits from the navigable success criteria are users with low vision. And that is so that way, when we are not obscuring focus, we are ensuring users with low vision are able to access whatever they are trying to look at, and that the focus appearance is apparent to users with low vision. This also supports keyboard interface only users, so sighted users who will, instead of using a mouse, only utilize that keyboard interface. So let's first review under the navigable guideline 2.4.11 focus not obscured minimum. And this is a level 2A criteria. So our summary here states that the component is not entirely obscured by authored content, right? So on the right-hand side, we have an example screenshot of a pop-up chat box at the right-hand corner, as well as this pop-up cookies information piece of information. And it's really obscuring quite a bit of content that's behind it. And so we want to make sure that any kind of content can be closed or dismissed via the keyboard so that users can actually get access to the content that they are trying to get to, right? So again, this chat model example on the right-hand side, the end user can use the chat to communicate with support from the travel company, but we don't need to have a keyboard interface only user required to accept a cookie notice so that they can gain access to that pop-up. So we just want to make sure that no content is being obscured. Now, one other note, on each of these slides, we will have icons in the upper right-hand corner indicating which group of people is most benefiting from this. So in this case, again, people with low vision as well as keyboard interface only users. So as we consider some focus not obscured considerations and examples, the considerations on the left-hand side talk about how this is gonna go beyond the limitations of an already existing criteria 2.4.7 focus visible. So this isn't an expansion on that. This isn't a difference in that. This is a way for us to move beyond that focus visible criteria and provide even further structure and support for users engaging with visual content. So we want to consider how when content is overlapping interactive content and the different kinds of responsive variations that are there, we want to make sure that users will not have to move the element to access focused element. So on the some of these examples include cookie and privacy notices, sticky headers and footers, toolbars, non-modal dialogues, chat widgets, and these are all really common things, right? So we want to make sure we're testing the initial state and making sure that focus obscuring content that can be opened and closed can also be closed with the keyboard without moving the focus. So on the right-hand side, we've got these two screenshots, one of which we have this zoomed in version of the travel company, and then the bottom of which is a standard size. So in the zoomed in example, we've got the end user that has their focus obscured as a result of that enormous cookies notice that occupies the entirety of the bottom half of the screen. So I'm just going to outline that for a moment, that your privacy cookies information fully blocks out that information on the bottom of the screen. Whereas the standard view example, the end user has the bottom three call to action buttons only partially obscured. So the user should be able to move their focus to there, and that would actually pass. So with the top example, it's entirely blocked, whereas this bottom one, we've got those partially visible. So as we continue, let us consider the enhanced version of focus not obscured at 2.4.12. And so in this case, at level 3A, when a user interface component receives keyboard focus, no part of the component is hidden by author created content. So this is going to be the criterion that really expands on that last one. And so whereas that bottom example we had just reviewed had some of those call to action buttons partially blocked, that would not actually pass at level 3A. So we want to make sure that if we're aiming for level 3A, nothing is going to be blocked, so the focus is never obscured. So how does this differ from 2.411 focus not obscured? There are absolutely no exceptions. And with our final new success criterion under the navigable guideline, 2.4.13 focus appearance, this is a guideline that is really focusing on the keyboard focus indicator. So again, this is another level 3A icon level criteria, and this is especially helpful for keyboard interface only users. And when the keyboard focus indicator is visible, we want to ensure that an area of the focus indicator meets all of the following. So we want to ensure that it is at least as large as the area of a 2 CSS pixel thick perimeter of the unfocused component or subcomponent, and has a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 between the same pixels in the focused and unfocused states. And effectively, this really is trying to create a much more apparent focus indicator for keyboard-only users. So the exceptions on the right-hand side include that the focus indicator is determined by the user agent and cannot be adjusted by the author, or the focus indicator and the indicator's background color are not modified by the author. So when we're considering the example on the screen of get started with that button, we've got a 2 pixel black and a 2 pixel white outline in focus with the button background that is fully white. And so that is giving us this extra apparent keyboard focus indicator. So we are at another pausing point for any questions about WCAG 2.2 navigable success criteria. I don't see anything immediately in the chat or Q&A. So at this point, I am going to go ahead and pass it back over to John.
Great, thank you. Now let's talk about input modalities. So who benefits from these criteria? So we have two. That's the dragging movement and the target size minimum. And the goal of these is to help people with motor disabilities, in particular hand and arm physical disabilities, and people with low vision that may have difficulties clicking on a particular target or tapping or dragging an object. So let's talk about dragging movements. So in summary, and this is a summary of the criterion, a single pointer-based method that doesn't require dragging mode is to be available for all functionality. And so, yeah, what does that mean? That you probably were saying, well, okay, what is dragging? That's a good question. Like, what is dragging? And I'll get to that in a minute. And then you probably say, okay, can I use an alternative? For example, I have a drag operation, but I also have another control. Can I rely on that? And so the answer is there are exceptions. And the behavior, if the behavior is essential, or if there's an alternative, or if it's controlled by the user agent. So what does that mean? So sometimes you may have a user agent based control Perhaps there is a widget, a certain type of slider that only works with dragging and not by clicking or tapping on the slider. So if it's part of the browser, if it's controlled by the browser, there is an exception. Or if it's essential for a particular task, then it would not be applicable. So let's move to the next slide to talk a little about what a dragging movement is, so we're all on the same page. So we have a prior success criterion 251 pointer gestures. So it's related to pointer gestures. So a pointer gesture is something where like a swipe left, swipe up, down, etc., where you have a midpoint. Whereas a dragging movement is a little bit different. A dragging movement is where you have a start and an end point, and it doesn't matter what the middle point is. You might also be asking, okay, I have a keyboard alternative. Can I keep my dragging because we have a keyboard command to perform the same action? And the answer is, in this case, no. The keyboard alternative is not acceptable. It has to be a single pointer-based alternative. And why that is, for example, if you're on a mobile device, you may not have a keyboard with you. And we also want to support pointer input users who may not be relying on a keyboard. And so that's why the keyboard alone cannot solve this. And this applies, as again, to all forms of pointer input, whether it be eye tracking software, or head tracking software, or a mouse, or a touchpad, whatever it might be. This is aimed at solving this pointer challenge. And why this is important is that some users will have a difficult time pressing a pointer down or using their eyes to engage and dragging to a location and then releasing. Those motions can be a complex set of motions. It can be difficult for some people using different type of assistive technology to perform. And so this will allow users to be able to use a single pointer alternative to perform that action. So let's go through the steps. So I alluded to earlier that a dragging motion is really something where you have a start point. You're holding down, if for example, if you were using a mouse or the touchscreen, you might be holding it down. You're then repositioning, and then you're releasing it at an endpoint. So that is sort of like a drag. Now, the gesture has to go through one intermediate point. And so I have a diagram of a gesture here where it starts on the left, it moves to the right, and then I can still move up or down. But once I've moved, so if you think about on your phone when you're swiping, it recognizes that you're moving left or right or up and down. And then even if you then move your finger or your pointer a different direction, it still interprets the gesture based on that midpoint, not on the endpoint. So if you want to play around with this, if you have a mobile phone or mouse, and try that and see the difference between gestures and dragging motions. Next slide. Okay, so that covers the dragging. Real quick, I forgot to mention, if there are alternatives for dragging, I would just say that you could have, for example, if you do have a dragging requirement, for example, a slider, you may be able to drag the slider, but you can also tap or click on the slider to perform the same action. So that's an alternative. So just like, for example, for gestures, like a pinch gesture to zoom into a map, you could have a plus button and a minus button to zoom in or zoom out on the map. So you're providing an alternative for those dragging gestures. And so that allows you to have your single pointer alternatives, just as an example. Okay, let's move to target size minimum. And just a note about this. So I said earlier there was target size previously in WCAG 2.1. It was a AAA item. Just want to call out real quick that that was renamed to target size enhanced, and that's 255. And the new 258 is the target size minimum. And so you're probably saying, oh, well, why didn't you have this one in 2.1? It was at the time, the group could only get a consensus. So the group could only get agreement on having the more strict target size enhanced, which has a much bigger area, but is much harder to achieve. They could only get consensus on having it at level AAA. In 2.2, the group was able to come to consensus on this new criteria that I'm going to be talking about. And so this is the outcome of that. And so that's why we ended up with 2, and the numbering seems a little bit backwards, but that's unfortunately the way it is. So how do we summarize this? So in summary, the size of the target for the pointer input is at least 24 by 24 CSS pixels. And so you're probably saying, okay, why CSS pixels? What does that mean? The reason it's defined as a CSS pixel, that's the cascading style sheets, is defined as that because this is actually defined as a measurement of view. So if you were standing in front of your monitor, it's a certain degree. And so it's based on a certain degree. And so that's why this was used. It's also a term that's used in other W3C documents, like the CSS specification. So that's why it was chosen. And then 24 by 24 pixels, you're probably saying, well, that might not be big enough for some people, right? Because we're not just talking about touch here, we're talking about pointer. That might not be big enough for some people, but the group had to find something that was reasonable and that wasn't too big, because the impacts to the user interface could be great, but it was significant enough to bring benefit to users who need this. And so that's where it was arrived on. And so I have an example on the right-hand side. We have a graphic, and we have some icons that are arranged horizontally, and they are 24 by 24 pixels in size. And so that's good. They're meeting the requirement, but you could do better. And so above that, I have 44 by 44 pixel icons. So that's better, but that's not required by this criteria. That's what's required at AAA. And so moving all along, you're probably saying, okay, well, what if I can't do a 24 by 24 pixels? What if that's not possible because of X, Y, Z? So there are lots of exceptions to this particular criterion. And so the main exception I'm going to talk about first is called undersized targets. And so the idea is that if you have a smaller target, you can still meet the requirement. And so one way of doing that is by making sure that your smaller target has enough space around it that it doesn't interfere with other targets. So maybe it's still difficult for someone to tap on, but the person who's trying to tap on it won't accidentally tap something else and be taken somewhere else and have to get back. So that's what it's trying to solve. It's trying to make it easier to not hit the wrong target. And so this undersized target, the way it works is that if you were to draw a circle, a 24 diameter circle onto the center of your component, if it doesn't intersect another target or an undersized circle from another undersized target, right, another circle, then you can still pass the requirement. So you could still have a very small, you could have an 8 by 8 target and still pass this criterion as long as you have sufficient size between it. And so that's my example here, where we have space between the 20 by 20 targets. There's 4 pixels of space, so we meet our requirement. And then lastly, we have an example where you have your 20 by 20 pixel targets, but in this case, the items don't have that space between them. And so this example fails because there's not sufficient space between those undersized targets. So what are some of the other exceptions? So there are exceptions for equivalent functionality. So the function can be achieved through a different control on the same page. It can also meet the requirement. So you might have an undersized target, but you have another link or button that does the exact same function. That's perfectly okay. You can still have the undersized target. You can still have, and you don't actually even have to test it as long as you have that alternative. The other one is inline exceptions. So one of the things that you might imagine is, I've got a bulleted list, and inside my bulleted list, I have links. I don't have enough space between those links, or I have a paragraph of text. That paragraph of text has links in it. I don't know if those links in that paragraph are going to stack on top of each other, because when I zoom in and zoom out, the paragraph changes, right? The width of the paragraph changes. So those links may be underneath of each other. Sometimes those links are in different places. That's a mess. I shouldn't, that's not under my control. Don't worry, there are exceptions for that. So if it's inline, if it's part of a sentence block of text where you don't have control over the line height, the line height is controlled by the text, you can still pass the criteria. So links within paragraphs, links within lists like this, where there's also plain text, could pass this criterion. There's also an essential requirement. So sometimes we've heard, the government says you have to have this size checkbox on this PDF document. Those exceptions are allowed as well, because there can be specific sizes mandated in certain government forms. So there's an exception for that too. And then lastly, there's a user agent exception. So it's very similar to where I talked earlier about dragging movements and the browser, the user agent, having exceptions. In this case, there are also exceptions for the user agent. So if, for example, you have a color picker and the color picker is provided by the browser, in that case is actually probably an alternative already. But even if there wasn't an alternative to the size requirement of the color picker, because it's provided by the user agent, you don't have to meet the requirement. You can still meet it by using the browser's color picker. Any questions about this? I know that's a lot of information. Some of these criterion are pretty complex, and there's a lot of exceptions that you have to test. You probably will have questions about, how do I actually test this, right? Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into all of these details, but if you have any quick questions, be happy to answer those.
This is Nell. John, we do have one question from this section and a remaining question from the earlier section. I'll start with this section. Somebody is asking, what is the ratio of space to size in order to pass target size?
Right. So the way I would think about target size is, if you have a 24 by 24 target, you're good. That's all you need. It doesn't matter. You probably do need to think about some situations where you have overlapping targets, where you have one target on top of the other. So you do need to consider those if that comes up, or a target inside of another target. There's lots of situations. There are some understanding documents that the W3C puts together that are informative, that go along with each one of these criterion. I would highly recommend that you look at those understanding documents to understand those different scenarios of overlapping or targets inside of other targets. But I would just say, to summarize this, if you're 24 by 24 size target and doesn't overlap, doesn't intersect another one, you're good. You don't need to do anything. There are tools to help you measure that. There's some favorites and browser bookmark tools, or there's also the developer tools. If you have smaller targets, that's when you need to think about the space between targets. So if your target is less than 24 pixels by 24 pixels, that's when you need to draw that imaginary circle that's 24 pixel diameter, and then you need to see if that circle then intersects other targets. So that's when you're really starting to look at the space between the controls. And then always think about your exceptions. So it's always good to rule out your exceptions first before you spend a lot of time measuring. So if you think an exception applies, you don't have to spend the effort trying to measure and calculate.
Great. This is Nell. Thank you, John. We also have a question asking, can you clarify who author indicates? So for example, the component is not entirely obscured by authored content.
Yes.
The focus indicator is determined by the user agent and cannot be adjusted by the author. So can you provide some clarity on who author indicates?
Good question. So the author is the person who has control over the web content. So in that case, it's not something caused by the browser. So it's definitely not if it's under the control of the browser. Sometimes the browser, you might have a scroll bar. The browser may have an alert dialog. The browser may have other user agent type things like that may be controlled by the video player. For example, if you're using the Chrome has a default video player, or it has a default color picker. So any type of those things that the browser renders, that would not be applicable in that case. So it's things that you as the author create, and I would say that includes third-party, content. Although you may not have control over it, if you chose to put third-party content on the website, you still have to meet the WCAG requirements.
Great, thanks so much, John. That is all in terms of questions for now, but we'll keep track of any more that come in. But for now, let's turn over to the second principle and its guidelines that the new WCAG 2.2 criteria fall under today. So our first of these two guidelines are new WCAG 2.2 predictable success criterion. So there is actually only one success criterion that's been added under WCAG 2.2. And that is under a level A criteria, actually. So like absolute necessity for 3.2.6 consistent help. And who most benefits from the new WCAG 2.2 predictable success criteria? And that is everyone needing help, but especially people who have low vision, people who are keyboard interface only users, and people with cognitive disabilities, as well as screen reader users. So as we can tell, it's a very large group of people, specifically because when people are looking for help, they want to be able to find it easily. And that's where this criterion comes from. So let's talk through the 3.2.6 consistent help criterion. And effectively, the summary here outlines that if help is provided, it must appear in a consistent location relative to order across pages in a set where help is provided. So do note that it's only a requirement if help is provided. It is not a requirement to provide help, though it is a better practice for everyone, obviously, to provide help. And so help can also include direct help or links to help pages. And so the consideration we want to keep in mind as we're considering how to incorporate success criterion 3.2.6 is that consistency is among pages with same variations and not between page variations on the same page, right? So if it's the same variation, we want that consistency across that variation. So let's consider a few examples. The first of which is an example of human contact details and a mechanism, right? So this is the level access information, contact information, including the physical address, directions to get to the physical address, a phone number, as well as an email. And so consistent help would present this information in the same location. In this case, that would be the footer, for example. So having that consistent help across the footer is going to help meet that criterion. The second example is that any kind of fully automated contact mechanism, such as a chatbot, should be found in the same location. So we've got, for example, these frequently asked questions that should actually be read as frequently asked questions, but effectively the frequently asked questions should be in the same location every single time. And then the third example should be that chatbot in the same location every single time. And effectively, if we're thinking about this from an analogy, we're thinking about how if we were to go into a brick and mortar store, we want to go to the customer service desk in the same location every single time. And it would be really frustrating if the customer service location ended up changing from the front part of the front right-hand corner of the store to the back left-hand corner to suddenly the middle of the store. So this criterion really is about ensuring that we are providing help in a consistent location across pages. So across the same variation and not between different variations, right? So we really do want to make sure we are having that consistent help example. So with that, let's now go to the second guideline under the operable principle for input assistance success criteria. And so this is our last section of success criteria under a guideline. And we will first talk through who most benefits from the new WCAG 2.2 input assistance success criteria. And so we actually have 3 separate levels for this example, right? We've got a level A 3.3.7 redundant entry success criteria. We now have a double A 3.3.8 accessible authentication minimum criteria. And then building on that minimum at AAA, we've got a 3.3.9 accessible authentication enhanced criteria. And who benefits from this? Once again, everyone. Which I know sometimes feels like well, of course it benefits everyone, but specifically it's going to especially help keyboard interface only users, people with cognitive disabilities, and users with low vision. So again, a very broad group of people who benefits from this because we are supporting multiple ways of having input complete. So as we consider our first new input assistance criteria, 3.3.7 redundant entry, the summary here states that when information previously entered is required to be entered again with the same process, it should be auto-populated or available for the user to select, right? And so we really do want to provide experiences in which people don't have to provide the same information over and over and over and over again. And I know I am not the only one who has entered information in the exact same form and then found myself having to do the same thing. So we want to prevent that from happening. We want to provide options to auto-populate or to select the option by the user. Now, there are some exceptions to this. The first of which is that if it is essential, right, unless it is essential, then we can reduce the need for this redundant entry criteria. If there are security purposes, or if the info is no longer valid. So maybe the information is no longer valid because something timed out, right? So some examples of how we can meet this criteria is providing the option in this first example to select from a dropdown. So you can select your address again, your home address, instead of having to re-enter that information. Another option is you allow users to copy and paste text. So that way they don't have to, again, enter that information. And we also can provide a third example of selecting a checkbox, such as billing address is the same as shipping address. And so a user should be able to toggle that and not have to refill that information. Once again, this is going to benefit everybody, but it's really going to be helpful for anyone who may have a cognitive disability and may struggle with having to confirm the same information that they already entered and not accidentally enter wrong information. Maybe somebody has some kind of mobility disability in their hands, and so re-entering information again on the keyboard could be really exhausting for them. So this criteria really is to support people in more efficient ways to provide information that's already been provided. Now, this second criteria under input assistance at level 2A is accessible authentication minimum. And many of us are becoming much more familiar with these if on a regular basis. So this is basically stating that a cognitive function test is not required for any step in an authentication process unless the following is provided. And I will talk through what a cognitive function test is here in a moment. But first, if we are providing an alternative then this will pass this criteria. If we have some kind of mechanism, so a mechanism is available to assist the user in completing the cognitive function test, then it will be pass this criteria. If there is some kind of object recognition, so the cognitive function test is to recognize objects, and I promise we will go through each of these examples here in a moment in more detail. Or if there is personal content and the cognitive function test is to identify non-text content that the user provided to the website. So what this success criterion is attempting to do is to ensure that there is an accessible, easy to use, and secure method to log in or access content or undertake tasks. Most websites right now still rely on usernames and passwords for logging in, but actually memorizing a username or password, especially when we're asked to have different usernames and passwords for every single website out there right now, or any other similar cognitive function test, can really place a very high, or in some cases, impossible burden for some people with different cognitive disabilities. So when we talk about cognitive function tests, what exactly are these? And the most common example is what we just talked through, which are usernames and passwords. So these rely on memorization. And so we might be asked to remember specific combinations of characters for our passwords and usernames, right? And so we might also be asked to remember certain characters or images or things like that, but effectively, we're being asked to memorize something. We have this cognitive test being completed. Another example is solving puzzles. So the example that pops up is this 16 square grid image authenticator for traffic lights, where the user has to actually solve the puzzle and select each of the traffic lights found in each square. And so this kind of puzzle test can also introduce an accessibility barrier. And we want to have users have an option to instead switch to another kind of cognitive function test. So that would be our alternative. And so that alternative could be to be an auditory cognitive function test, where instead of having to see something and identify it, people have to parse out the audio, which is hopefully provided well. We also have copying MFA codes, calculations, CAPTCHAs, and so on. And basically any kind of test that is providing, is asking a user to memorize something, do something with their cognitive functions, that is going to fall under this criteria. So some accessible authentication examples and considerations we want to keep in mind for the AAA level include alternatives, such as the user using biometrics, such as fingerprints or facial recognition. So we can have that be provided and kind of cut out that username and password approach. We can have mechanisms provided where people have a password field that supports paste or password managers, so people don't have to always enter the information character by character, but can instead copy and paste it in. We can also have object recognition examples, so the user can recognize objects such as images or video or audio. And we can have personal content examples where users can identify non-text content that the user has previously provided to the digital property. So sometimes you can provide an image of a dog or a video or some kind of audio, and that would then be an appropriate exception to the rule, and it would help meet the criteria. Some considerations is that this criteria does not cover non-authentication cognitive function tests, and CAPTCHAs are allowed when they are recognizing objects or personal content. So the enhanced version of this, we're going to talk through it very quickly, is that instead of having some kind of exceptions, so a cognitive function test such as remembering a password or solving a puzzle is not required for any step in an authentication process. Unless that step provides at least one of the following. So with the enhanced version, we can have alternatives. So we can have another authentication method that does not rely on a cognitive function test. And we can also have mechanisms available to assist the user in completing the cognitive function test. So how does this exactly differ from 3.3.8 accessible authentication minimum? Object recognition and personal content will no longer be exceptions. So it's a little bit more restrictive than the minimum criteria that we just reviewed. So with that in mind, do we have any questions about WCAG 2.2 predictable and input assistance success criteria? Let me check. So thank you, John, for answering some of the questions that came up. So would the 3.2.6 requirement indicate that the address, directions, phone be in the same order across the site to be compliant? And so John answers, when they appear on a page within a set of related pages, they need to be in the same relative order. It does not require that they are provided on a page if they are not. And then we have a second question of, is there a definition of same process for 3.3.7? What constitutes a same process? And we have provided a link to understanding related to that takes you straight to the W3C. And then we have one more question. I'm not sure I understand the difference between CAPTCHA and an object recognition method. Yeah, let's talk through that in a little more detail. So CAPTCHA is going to be some of those tests that we saw that are kind of solving puzzles, whereas object recognition can, instead of having a puzzle that's a little bit more complicated, can have let's say a photo of a single object that then needs to be resolved. John, do you want to add anything to that answer?
Yeah, I would just say for this, for the AA criteria, it is acceptable for you to upload your own object that's not text. So you could upload a picture of your pet. That would be acceptable because you could be able to identify that object. That's probably easier because if you supply that object, you may be able to more easily identify that object. That would be different than having to solve a puzzle. I think why the AA version of this allows for it basically allows for CAPTCHA that uses object identification, such as identify all the bikes or identify all the stoplights. Those CAPTCHAs are a huge barrier for people, but the criterion could not have passed if it banned CAPTCHAs outright. And so that's why it took the approach of trying to make sure that the CAPTCHAs that only had object recognition could be allowed, because that's pretty common, like in today with things like reCAPTCHA. Some of the challenges, though, I just throw out, many of the object recognition ones today also have audio alternatives, but a lot of the audio alternatives require transcription. So the alternative actually may fail for the audio one. I have found some audio identification ones that says, you listen to a sound, may say it's a buzzing bee, and it says, select what sound you heard, and the choice might be a buzzing bee or a frog or something like that. And so those could potentially pass this criteria because it's sort of, you're identifying the object audibly as an alternative to the visual CAPTCHA, rather than having to transcribe an audio message, which is a lot more difficult for some users.
Great, thanks so much. So we're going to get into this last section for what do we do now. And before I pass it over to John, I know one of the questions many of you are asking, so what do I do in my role? And we do actually have a resource for that. And so what we will be doing with the recording afterwards is sharing the recording as well as a Word document that includes all of the links from today's session, as well as specific directions for both developers and designers for each of these success criterion. They're really kind of broad information, but they are to help provide some structure for how to incorporate that. And to speak to John's point at the very beginning, most of these success criteria will be best implemented if they are identified and incorporated at that design stage as opposed to the developer stage. And so that's going to be part of how the resource frames a lot of adding these criteria in your role specifically. So with that, I will pass it over to John to wrap us up through this final section.
Great, thank you, Nell. So as I mentioned earlier, and as we provided a link, there's some great understanding documentation from the W3C. So the success criteria in WCAG don't change, except for maybe if there's a misspelling or something like that. They're fixed. They're fixed in time on a certain date. But how we interpret and understand those criteria can change as technology changes. New versions of browsers come out, new assistive technologies come out, and so this understanding can change. And so there's these other documents called understanding documents that are more living, evergreen documents that can help you understand the criteria. And I highly recommend those because they provide a lot of great information on how to interpret it. They provide some figures and things like that. There's also techniques, both sufficient techniques and failure techniques that help you understand what can I do to meet the criteria and what would fail it. And so those are helpful techniques to look at. Just keep in mind that just because you have a sufficient technique doesn't mean you have to follow that. There's many ways you can meet any of the criteria, many ways. And sufficient techniques are not required. They're just one way that's been documented to meet the criteria. And there's also a what's new document that's provided with from the W3C that helps you understand the user personas, a little bit of what we talked about, some of the need and why the different criteria were created. So that may be a helpful document as well. So next you may be saying, okay, well, this is great for web content. Can I apply these to other places? How do they apply to documents or native applications? Because that's software, it's not web content. And so you may be aware of something. There's some guidance already that exists from the W3C on applying WCAG to non-web ICT. ICT stands for Information, Communication, and Technology. But that older document only covered WCAG 2.0. AAA, it was used in Section 508 or in reference by Section 508, which is the U.S. federal procurement standard, but it needs to be updated. It is in the process of being updated. There are working drafts and editors drafts that are out there. If you'd like to take a look at that, it does provide information as well on non-web software like native applications. It's not going to provide you specific technical guidance on how to apply it to mobile. What it's basically going to say, how does this apply to mobile? If you were to apply it to mobile, how would it apply? And so you'll find that some of the criteria may not apply because there's no, for example, some of the criteria like consistent help apply to sets, web pages within sets of web pages. So that just means like similar web pages on a site that are created by the same person for the same purpose. Well, on a mobile application, you're not going to have that. Okay, it's not the same. You don't apply it to screens. It would actually be sets of software. And so how often do you see a set of software? Well, very rarely. Maybe Microsoft Office, something like that. So some of those criteria are not going to apply to mobile simply because the concepts don't apply across from web to mobile. And so that document will help you make those mappings between those. So I highly recommend starting to look at it. It should be published probably in the next quarter, I would imagine. So that's something to be on the lookout for. And then we'll cover documents as well. But moving on to adoption of WCAG 2.2 is probably on your mind. What's happening in the US right now? Section 508, as I alluded to earlier, it's still on WCAG 2.0, A and AA, plus additional requirements for software and hardware and things like that. It's possible that 2.2 could be adopted into the standards, but may not likely to be. What we are finding though is that some US federal agencies have said they are adopting their agency policy to be WCAG 2.1 or 2.2. So we are finding that some agencies want to be proactive. They want to go above and beyond what Section 508 requires, and they are requiring additional standards like 2.1 and 2.2. So just keep that in mind. In different other entities in the US as well may be moving. So I've talked to lots of different states. Some states are on 2.0, some are on 2.1, some states are moving to 2.2. For example, Colorado has public entity requirements that are coming into force this summer. Next year, so this summer, they're going to be requiring 2.1. But next year, in 2020 or 2025, they'll be requiring WCAG 2.2. So many states are starting to look at adopting 2.2 as well. And then we expect advocates also to be seeking WCAG 2.2 in demand letters and litigation and things like that. There's still a good argument to say that if you're meeting 2.1 or 2.0, that you're likely pretty accessible and you could probably defend that under the ADA. But what we saw in the past with Department of Justice, anytime they did a settlement with an organization, they tended to reference the most recent version of the standard. So it very well could be possible that Department of Justice, when they do have a settlement decree, they request 2.2. That remains to be seen, but that is the current version of the standard. Now, also related to the Department of Justice, there was some last October, there was some rulemaking, a proposed rulemaking on Title II of the ADA, which applies to state and local governments in the US. They were considering WCAG 2.1 as a requirement. A lot of people wrote in and said they should require 2.2. We don't know what's going to happen, but they were looking at using 2.1. So at this point, there will be a lot of different standards out there. If you're 2.2, though, you're backwards compatible. So that's it's a small lift, but it will make sure that you meet all of the different requirements that could be there. And then in Europe, what we know is currently Europe standard is on EN 301549. That's the European standards similar to Section 508. It is on WCAG 2.1. They are updating it as we speak to 2.2. That was expected this year, but I think it'll be 2025. It'll be updated to support the EU Accessibility Act. So sometime between now and then, it will come out with 2.2, almost certainly with 2.2 in it, and that will then be required by e-commerce sites and a lot of other things in Europe next summer. We're also finding that other laws are being updated to include 2.2 as well, including this October for the UK public sector. So things are continually moving. And so that will take us to then the future on the next slide, which is what's next in WCAG. And so 2.2 is here to stay. It will be here for many years. It won't be going away. So it's not going to be made obsolete, but the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group at the W3C is finished with 2.2. They're still making some updates to those informational documents to clarify things, to update understanding, but they're not expecting to come out with a 2.3 or 2.4 version of WCAG. The efforts are really focused on WCAG 3, and WCAG 3 will have a whole new structure. It'll have a new conformance model. It'll be very, in the sense of the structure of it, it will be very different. Now, all the work you're doing for 2.2, that will carry over. So it will, WCAG 2X is the base that will go into 3.0, but that base is going to be added onto, and it's also going to be reworded, changed. There might be more flexibility. We don't know how all that's going to work out. So the work you're doing won't be a waste. It'll be the base, but it's going to be a different model. And I would say expect that in probably 3 to 5 years for WCAG 3. WCAG 2.2 is going to be around for many years. Continue to focus on that right now. And if you're interested in tracking WCAG 3, I encourage you to look at that and provide comments. If not, continue to work on WCAG. Now, just lastly, when I say all this, I would say that WCAG sort of is the minimum. So we always recommend working with users that have disabilities to really understand how they use technology, and making sure you go above and beyond the standards to make things actually usable for a larger group of people.